it's quite important before I just started on the topic to tell you a little bit about me beyond my bio, because that's really important for intersectionality. I am, as Katie said, a legally trained international human rights expert. I'm from Brazil. I lived in 4 countries. I'm married, heterosexual, and in spite of my white skin, I have mixed heritage. So about roughly 50% of my heritage is from Portugal, and the other 50% is from African descent and indigenous descent from Brazil. And I think that's really important for this topic, positioning myself in terms of that spectrum, and also reminding ourselves that where we stand and our privileges and where we come from really affect the way we see and analyze a particular topic. So I've been asked to discuss with you what would it mean to create an intersectional gender architecture for Scotland. Throughout this presentation, I will go over some key issues. I don't propose to have an exhaustive presentation because of time, but we can definitely discuss some other points that you'd like to discuss during Q&A. Throughout the presentation, there are a lot of links to things that are extremely interesting, particularly referring to other organizations, wonderful feminist organizations based in Scotland and beyond. I believe the presentation will be shared with you afterwards, so please do click on that afterwards. I don't think I'll have time to cover everything, but I will certainly try to refer to it. So intersectionality, I believe this group will be familiar with the topic, so I will go through it really quickly. But as we all know, this was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and affirms that intersectional identities such as race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics need to be considered to understand power, and unequal power manifestations such as racism, sexism, colonialism, and etc. This basically means that if you're talking about the experience of a woman in rural Bolivia, that will be very different from someone living in urban Scotland. This is important because then we depart from a completely different standpoint. We don't depart from the assumption that women are part of this homogeneous group, and there is this assumed sisterhood with common priorities and common obstacles. The obstacles are different. Some priorities might be the same, some priorities might be different, and I think we need to be mindful of that, particularly when we're talking about intersectionality. What's important to say is that we often find that certain groups are often further left behind, or rather kept behind, as we like to say at Christian Aid. And women and ethnic and religious minorities are the ones that we found for our work, and also through the research that we use, are the ones that are being most marginalized, particularly women of color. This means that those groups are normally racing against the clock to catch up with the rest of us, and sometimes can't even catch up. And I think this is very important when we're talking about this current context, when we're thinking about COVID, the effect of COVID, for example. There are a lot of people that are struggling to survive, and even discussions about lockdown, it's completely elusive to them if you're talking about urban settlements in urban Brazil, for example. And I think we need to understand that, because we often try to create this magic solution that will be, serve as a blanket approach for everyone. And what intersectionality tells us is that we actually need to stop, analyze the data, and cater for different contexts. So I think that what I normally say, that we need to be systematically intersectional that means to be systematically thinking of intersectionality and systematically assessing things against intersectionality to make sure we are hitting the goals we set ourselves. And you can see on this graphic, you know, the different social markers. It's also not an exhaustive list and how they connect. And we've put as Christian aid poverty at the center because sometimes, particularly when you're talking about in the development sector, you either talk about poverty and then you talk about inequality, but actually they interconnect and reinforce each other. And I think that this is an important thing to think about, particularly when we're designing our own work. So what an intersectional gender architecture would like? It would mean challenging our own assumptions, untangling definitions of vulnerability, being aware of language and labels that stigmatize and disempower. It also means disaggregating data, using at least as a minimal threshold. Some of us say sex, age, and disability. Some of us say gender, age, and disability. Or at least creating a minimal threshold depending on the context you're in terms of the social markers that you really want to track. And do it in a way to flesh out the different levels of vulnerability experienced by the individuals and communities, and how you can narrow that gap or completely erase it. Christian Aid released a report called Leave No One Woman Behind, which you can see here. It has some recommendations which I'll circle back to at the end of this presentation, and has some really good examples in terms of what we've seen through our global footprint. It doesn't go in depth in terms of what an intersectional gender architecture looks like, but it does have some more lived experiences of intersectionality, which I think it's how then we reach the point where we can say an intersectional gender architecture should analyze how inequality generates and sustains poverty and vice versa, which I mentioned in the previous slide. Recognizes poverty as multidimensional. So not understanding poverty as extreme poverty or based on economic indicators, rather multidimensional, and looking really as ending poverty as a way to really end freedom, you know, and ensuring freedom from want. It applies a people-centered human rights approach. People-centered human rights approach basically means not having a top-down, and there is a lot of critique in terms of the international human rights landscape and how that completely obliterates diversity. In a people-centered human rights approach, it goes the other way around. It's bottom-up, and it's very much centered in the experiences from the global south. I don't have time to go in depth, but we can circle back to that during Q&A if you'd like to. It uses gender as an entry point, and I put that in bold because when I towards the second part of this presentation, when I talk about Scotland specifically, I'll mention this, and I think this is connected to policy coherence as well. I mean, at least agreeing with everyone that you use gender as an entry point to look at other vulnerabilities and marginalization, and how they connect in our experience in different levels. An intersectional gender justice architecture also uses a transformative political economy analysis as a cornerstone. As I said, I think really understanding the data or producing data and analysis in order for you to respond to the context. And that analysis I would recommend is having a political economy dimension to it, and proactively challenges inequality through affirmative action, targeted programs, indicators, social policy, and social protection. I think there is a lot of expertise here on this call on those topics, so I won't go into detail. But I think if we're really truly committed to tackling intersectional injustice, we must focus on those that are furthest behind. And that's why I'm mentioning affirmative action. Sorry, for 1 minute, I think my presentation kind of froze, but I think it's back. So what does it mean to people on a personal level? What does it mean to be talking about an intersectional gender architecture? It means being aware of your own privileges and to the extent possible, use them to challenge the status quo. As I said, positionality, understanding who you are, where you come from, and how you see different aspects. Whenever you can, give away power. That's really important. I think, I'm not sure if Talat is on the call, but I think I've linked to some of her work on Pass the Mic here as a very excellent example of that. So to not only give away power, but help others, particularly women of color, reach unlikely power positions. Sometimes there's a lot of there are a lot of trends, and there's a lot of accounts of people actually rising to power, but not necessarily keeping those spaces open for others coming after. Denouncing abuse and discrimination and supporting whistleblowers. And thinking how you're personally contributing to transformative change. This is really important, because sometimes we just think, well, I don't discriminate against anyone. I'm fine. But it's not only about not discriminating, but it's, well, obviously thinking through if that's really true, if there is no assumptions that you hold, but also actively challenging discrimination and those that discriminate. And I think the Black Lives Movement really focus on that point. It's not enough to be not being racist. It's about being anti-racist. So it's not enough not being pushy for colonial thinking. You need to be anti-colonial, and so forth and so on. So it means having an active engagement in tackling oppression. And I put down an example there on below the photo as an example. There are a lot of a group of wealthy individuals wrote I think it was a letter, if I'm not mistaken, demanding more taxes to fund the COVID-19 recovery, and therefore understanding their role in making sure the people that were furthest behind could be attended to during this horrible crisis. So what does it mean to the private sector? It means looking at the root causes of inequalities, such as neoliberalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. It means actively promoting and strengthening the role of the state. This is a really important one. I think sometimes the private sector, because it's based on a model which I think needs to be revisited, and that's very clear with the COVID pandemic. It pushes for a model that's very focused on growth, and therefore growing exponentially, and therefore thinking that you just need to push for public-private partnerships, regardless of what that means to people. But actually, what we're seeing is that in some cases and in some sectors, that's not the solution. So sometimes you do need a really strong state to be able to respond quickly and to attend to those that are most marginalized. And I also think that promoting state-led institutions such as the UN, which is fundamental in addressing inequalities and providing social protection at global level, is really key. The other point is funding initiatives that analyze and challenge intersecting inequalities, such as supporting data disaggregation. And lastly, but not exhaustively, doing no harm, making sure that they prevent practices or actively restrain themselves from engaging with practices that take away essential resources from those marginalized, and that might be anything related to tax avoidance or any corporate practices that, for example, when you're talking about transnationals, are implemented in the global south but not necessarily take into account the community's needs, priorities, and challenges. There's an example I put down below this photo here of the Business Roundtable. It's an American group of large corporations who issued a manifesto called Purpose of a Corporation, saying that corporations should move from a shareholder model of focusing on sharing profit within their own constituents and towards a stakeholder model, looking more at the social role of corporations. So that shows that they're already thinking of how to change and how to respond to our current environment, which is, it's great. So what does that mean to development, to the development sector as a whole? It means sustaining the energy, the political engagement with the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen many statements, particularly on social media, supporting Black Lives Matter, but I think statements are a starting point, but we actually need action. And sometimes things get stopped at the very first stage of issuing a statement. So it's okay, so we issued a statement, recognize the issue, great, how can we act on it? The other one is politicizing the Me Too movement. Sometimes it can be really focused on a particular set of women who are privileged and therefore not focusing on the systems of oppression and power, which are particularly key for us to tackling inequality, particularly from an intersectional lens. And lastly, but so important, addressing and decolonizing development. And I put some suggestions here, but there are more. So for example, addressing the North-South divide, enhancing intersectional representation in boards, senior management positions, and staff recruitment, adopting anti-racist policy and training, creating a robust accountability system to guarantee policy is implemented, and systematically analyzing the root causes of poverty and inequality from an intersectional lens. And I think there are some organizations and networks that are already working on this. I've inserted a link here to the Women of Color forum, the UK Gender and Development Network, which is a good example of that. So what does it mean to governments? It means to decolonize public policy and practices and practice. And I've put 5 examples of that. The first one is analyze how neocolonialism or colonialism, patriarchy, and neoliberalism affect outcomes at national and subnational level. Research blueprints that appropriately tackle inequality. Create roadmaps with clear, short, medium, long-term deliverables, deadlines, and responsibilities. Lead in an inclusive way and make sure women, in particular women of color, are in the driving seat of those initiatives. And that's really important because sometimes we create beautiful roadmaps, beautiful deliverables, but then we get white men from the global north telling us how we should include women of color, which is very, it's a big paradox. And I think we really need to make sure that we have the right people in the driving seat with power to change and adapt those programs. And lastly, champion intersectionality subnationally, nationally, and overseas. So if you are a champion, if you have good experiences, you should be able to share that with others so you can have this sense of community, that we are all striving towards the same goal of making sure we have a future where everyone thrives. And I think a good example of a policy that tackles that is the student quota system created for Afro-descendants during the Lula administration in Brazil. It actively promoted people of color in those spaces. And that leads to the following slide. So what are the good practices that we can think of when we're talking about intersectionality? And I put on brackets incomplete because not, to my knowledge, there is no one good example of a holistic, comprehensive, intersectional gender architecture to this date. There are pockets of work that are that have been done in the past or are being implemented now that could be used as an example to see how you can enhance your own architecture in Scotland. So one of them is New Zealand under the administration and their work they're doing on anti-discrimination, the anti-discrimination law. Bolivia under the first half of the Morales administration on the decolonization agenda and the cosmovision, which is an indigenous term, understanding we are a whole with nature. So understanding we are part of this one unison ecosystem, and therefore trying to challenge this idea that the way we produce policy should come or reject indigenous knowledge. There are challenges that, I mean, all of them have challenges. I won't focus on the challenges, so I'm focusing on the positive. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, the quota system in Brazil, I also think is a really good one, particularly looking at affirmative action. And how can you can use a temporary measure to speed up the results while you're tackling structural causes. I don't think affirmative action is a solution per se, but it is an immediate action to try to narrow the gap. So now we reach the second part of the presentation, which focuses on Scotland. And I was trying to unpack what would this mean for Scotland specifically. I think I could think of three things in particular: celebrating considerable achievements. I think having a female first minister, a cabinet that's 50% women, and purposeful councils and committees such as this council, also the Equality, Inclusion and Human Rights Committee in Parliament are really good achievements that you should celebrate and perhaps share with others so others can replicate. Be vigilant of macho culture. I've read your previous reports and I think they're excellent. I don't think there's anything there that I don't agree with, and I think they show, it's quite clear that you're very aware there is a very strong patriarchal culture that's quite present in Scotland still, unfortunately. But also I would point out racism, xenophobia, and more recently backlashes against gender equality and women's rights, which is particularly worrisome during the period of COVID. I mean, a lot of governments are using, and that's not the case for Scotland, thankfully, but in a lot of governments overseas are using COVID as a smokescreen to further roll back hard-won rights. And I think we need to be really vigilant and sometimes use our own political capital to push against those when we can. And then focus on what is yet to be achieved. Celebrate, be vigilant, but don't forget, don't lose sight of what you're trying to get to. So how can you reach a fully diverse and inclusive society and systems, and do what you're doing now, obviously having those very open and honest discussions. I think that's the right way to go. And I think one example is that the progress amongst people of color is still too slow. I think there's a lot of progress when you're talking about women, particularly white women, but not necessarily women of color. Obviously, I mean, even the progress with women, it's not reaching the levels that we would have liked, but I think there is a bit of a discrepancy in terms of the different groups of women we could think of when we're looking at Scotland. So what's already in place? I won't spend a lot of time on this because I think you're all you're the experts. I rather think I'm facilitating the discussion that you're probably going to have in future. But from the scan of the reports you've created, and from other documents that I've been exposed to, I think there is a lot of work on policy coherence, focusing on intersectionality and beyond. This council has worked on policy coherence and systems mapping as one of the annual themes. And it's great that it has a very important role in advising the First Minister on gender equality and what can be done and improved in terms of the government's policies and systems. I think you use the use of systems theory and thinking to challenge multiple discriminations is fundamental for intersectionality. So I think I feel that's being done, and maybe you might want to correct me during Q&A, but I feel that's being done well. And I sometimes when you look at other governments, you talk a lot about, so for example, gender-based violence or FGM or other gender-specific issues, but they don't necessarily think of what are the root causes of those issues. And I think you're tackling that, which is great. There's a strong and vibrant feminist civil society. That's really important for intersectional gender architecture. The Equalities, Inclusion, and Human Rights Committee has youth participation and interaction with civil society. I think this channel with civil society is really important, and having that expert body, it's also fundamental for holding responsibility and holding others accountable. The national performance frameworks, measuring progress against the national outcomes, and such as those focusing on SDG 5 on gender equality and SDG 10 on inequalities more general, which I think is particularly important for intersectionality. There are positive trends in climate justice. I think hosting COP26, unfortunately not this year, but the next one, it's really good. I'd like to point out that one of the main achievements of the Madrid COP, it's frustrating in some ways, but one of the main achievements was the Gender Action Plan. And I think there is a really big role to play in pushing that as one of the achievements of COP26 as well. And I think as a whole, Scotland has a really important role to play in that regard. There is clear support for international human rights law and frameworks. The equally safe national strategy to prevent and eradicate violence against women and girls. The Equality Unit upgraded to Equality, Inclusion, and Human Rights Directorate, which I know is an outcome of one of your reports. So I think you should be extremely proud of that one. And the Human Rights Act of '98 and Equality Act of 2010. Just to name a few. I think that's quite a mouthful, right? I mean, I kind of had to take a breath to go through the whole list. So I think, as I said, celebrating those achievements and really understanding how you're championing some issues as a country. So what's not in place yet, and with emphasis on the yet, you're not talking about gender integration, you're mostly talking about mainstreaming. Christian Aid, as an expert, as a gender expert who's very aware of the academic discussions, there's a lot of discussion on whether mainstreaming is the right word, because it can be everyone's but no one's responsibility, and it can be this very buzzword, a development buzzword that we use to say, yeah, we've done it, but actually becomes a bit of a tick box exercise, and sometimes is about saying we're reaching women and men, and that misses the mark. And some of us are using the language of integration, saying, yes, okay, so if talking about mainstreaming is recognizing that gender equality or intersectional gender equality is everyone's responsibility, but we need to also ensure we have accountability systems to make sure everyone's acting on their responsibility and held to account if they don't do that. So that's one thing that I haven't seen. I think there is a lot of language on gender mainstreaming being used. The other thing I've noticed is that there is a clear decision on, there isn't a clear decision on inclusion, on the inclusion entry point. Sometimes there is a discussion of equalities more broadly, human rights. There's a cabinet for the secretary for social security and older people. So there's a discussion of age. If you are talking about intersectional gender architecture, I would assume you would be using gender as an entry point to discuss the other inequalities or social markers promoting inequalities. So that's one of the things that I've noticed. The other thing is I've noticed that, well, I didn't find rather the explicit recognition of that gender-only structures and policies are not enough to tackle intersectional inequalities. I know that the council has recognized that. I haven't seen those in government documents, but as I said, you are the experts on it. I would have liked to see more of a coherent approach to gender, moving away from the binary women and men, or at least recognizing that we recognize gender as a spectrum, but we will be focusing on women and men for resources, for example. And I say that particularly as a feminist who worked a lot with feminist organizations prior to joining Christian Aid, that we need to make sure we are not undermining the work that others are doing in this area. And I know that a lot of feminists are pushing really hard for this holistic definition of gender, and we need to be very vigilant we're not undermining that. So it's just, it's just one detail. I don't think that's very massive. I think a non-prescriptive list of social markers would be useful. I noticed that in the Equality Act of 2010, there is a prescriptive list of the social markers you would tackle. Be interested to know if anyone involved in that. What are the thoughts in terms of that? If you thought that was the best way to go. I think the whole point in intersectionality is that because it's context driven, you never know what are the other social markers that might be particularly relevant to one's context. So I would normally recommend not being prescriptive, so using languages such as and so forth and so on. And the last point on this slide is, and I think this links to that point, and then the work that you've all been doing on policy cohesion, is that I think I would have liked to see a coherent direction of travel on GESI, or gender equality and social inclusion, and intersectionality. Obviously, because we're all evolving, intersectionality is a fairly new term. I think, as you know, we're upgrading and refreshing strategies, plans, and governmental bodies. But I mean, I think at some point it would be good to have more coherence across and within. So I think that's leads to the next slide, which is looking at how to assess the system. I think and this is a values-based point, the first bullet point is so how can we push for more fraternity and solidarity when we are pushing for particular policies. And so it's also thinking of how particular policies can change mindsets rather than create more silos, or say we need to do that because, and I'm talking about particularly about the quota system, for example. You should create a quota system. We need to do that because that's government policy, that's law. Yeah, we need to do that because that's government policy or law, but because there is a thinking behind it, because there is a need to be standing in solidarity with others who have been historically marginalized for many years or centuries. and we all will benefit from equality. I think it's important to think globally and act locally. I think Scotland already does that. It looks at vertical alignment. I know that it's also introduced into the UK landscape, and there is a bit of a limit in terms of how much Scotland does and how that's related to the UK responsibilities. That needs to be embedded into a horizontal alignment, and I think that's the one that is linked to the previous slide on like having more coherence across the structures and policies. Important to practice what is being preached. I think concrete roadmaps with indicators, responsibilities, and accountability measures is really important, and linking back to my point about integration. Improving new and existing tools to develop, scrutinize, and evaluate legislation, policy, and practice. I think this one was actually a recommendation in one of your reports, so you would be very familiar with that. Transparent learning and adaptive programs that are localized and context-driven. I think with intersectionality, what you need to understand is that sometimes when it's almost like if you're kind of trying to do pyramids with a deck of cards, and when you move one of them, the whole thing might fall. And sometimes when you're talking about a system of oppression, that's great. But if you're talking about the social structure of a particular community, that's not desirable. So if you think that things are shaking, you might need to adapt. So there is a degree of flexibility that needs to be inserted into policies and programs to be context responsive. That's important. And also transparency to make sure that others understand where you're going with that, and that can input. I mean, I'm not only thinking civil society, but I'm thinking society more broadly. Removing the issue of intersectionality, intersectional gender equality from a women-only silo. I think we all know that as experts. I mean, it's unfortunately, it's still very much driven I think, unfortunately, by women and in women-only spaces. I would like to see more diversity in that, because I think that guarantees ownership and guarantees results. Important to address the lack of services and barriers to access to minorities, such as people that have disabilities, LGBT women, and also give power to women of color and other ethnic minorities. And I think that this has, I mean, some of this work has been done by many of you. I can think of in gender, for example. So it's nothing that I'm coming up with as new. I'm just pulling out some of the things that you've been working with as a group or separately in your own organizations. I think this move gets me to the point, to some of the questions you've asked me to respond to. I was given a quite clear briefing in terms of what I should cover during this session. And the question was about how can we measure and report on it. I think definitely we can. Whether or not we already have a good blueprint, that's a different question. I think there are a lot of initiatives in terms of how to do it. But because intersectionality is still fairly new and it's being recognized by governments and by the different actors progressively, I don't think there is still very robust enough or nothing that I could confidently share with you at this point as one complete blueprint. But we could definitely discuss this at another point if you're interested in thinking of how the different, there are strong monitoring and reporting bits that we could potentially say if they're combined together, they would create a strong blueprint. I don't think we have time to do that now. But one of the things that you could do as you create your own blueprint, you could review the NPF indicators from intersectional gender lens, combine quantitative and qualitative methods, recognize non-mainstream knowledge, as I was saying about indigenous knowledge, the ones that are not normally being profiled in government spaces. I mean, sometimes communities can come up with the greatest and most out-of-the-box solutions, and we just need to listen to them and raise those voices. Ensure gender experts are aiding or collecting disaggregated data and monitoring progress, systematize learning and adapt accordingly. As I said before, hold open, democratic, and honest conversations about progress. Again, this is a really good example of that. There is a case study here on how we as an organization, as Christian Aid, had a bit of a journey to travel, convincing people across the organization that we really needed to collect disaggregated data. But I won't go through that. What would be a potential criteria for assessing the frameworks? I put two examples here from academic. One is from an academic article, and the other one is from Save the Children. But there are many more. So, for example, you could break down national averages and then look at what are the particular social markers that you want to track. In this particular case, they looked at gender. They didn't look at other, interestingly enough, but they looked at urban, rural. And this other reference to the right of the screen clearly sets out how different it is for you to have an assessment framework that looks at intersectionality. So the first one is vertical, looking at vertical inequality, so averages, and then like this big round ball looking at how everyone ranked. So talking about women as if we're part of this whole homogeneous group. There's this whole horizontal inequality, setting groups separately as if, so let's say people of color didn't have gender as an issue. And then looking at an assessment framework that would look at intersecting inequalities, that would have this Venn diagram that would really look at how they intersect and connect. There's another one that I've that was done by Parkin and Young. I won't go through the whole thing now, and I leave that with you so you can have a look later. I like this one because it looks at policy and the expertise that you need to have an intersectional policy. And I think it's fairly adaptable. So at the very top of the graphic, you can see, you know, policy expertise, equality expertise, and human rights expertise, but you could definitely adapt it to your own context, and then it goes through every stage of the policy process. So like, look at the preparation of the mapping. So what are the right questions that you should be asking yourself in terms of the outcomes, and the structures that are in place perpetuating inequality, and is this policy really making sure that you're tackling those issues, or is this policy actually creating other inequalities that you didn't think it would? And I think that then goes down to other things that, such as how the policy would operate and how to create a good ethical evidence base for you to create new programs, to showcase what you've done, to track progress, and so forth and so on. And that would lead to, you know, obviously collating results, systematizing, and the findings. And that would be stage one. That's what they call the preparation stage. And then this would be stages 2, 3, and 4. Then matching that with the vision. What is the vision you started with? Road testing that vision, and then monitoring and evaluating the final progress. So there's sort of an intermediate ways of systematizing the findings, and then this sort of end of the process, the larger evaluation. So I'm just going to end with some provocations. As I said, I think some of the things I've seen are more from my perspective of reading some of the documents that were shared with me, some of the other things that I've been exposed to prior to being invited. So I don't want to leave you with suggestions per se, because I think, as I said, I think I'm more of an enabler for a conversation that you might have as a group. So what are the high-level provocations? I think we need to reflect on the colonial past that we all have, and ensure in-depth colonial history is part of curricular and training for public officials. Create quotas for people of color in public administration and education. Promote quality leadership. Address inequality and correlated issues such as violence against women and girls from an intersectional lens. Ensure holistic action by, for instance, ensuring intersectional approach to the gender pay gap and the COVID-19 recovery. I think there will be a very big issue related to how we recover globally, but also individually as countries. And I think how you respond really is a testament. It will be an indicator how committed countries are to tackling inequalities. And substantially increase resources available to assist with intersectional mainstreaming and integration. And that's how I'm saying it is a testament to how we're committed, because in a space where we have limited resources and less resources, particularly during the COVID with the economic downturn, what you prioritize, it's really key. Normally, women's rights and gender equality are used as trade pins for political processes, elections, for example, and are normally the first ones crossed off when the budgets are crunched. So I'd be interested to see what comes up next. So that's why it's a provocation. What are the specific provocations? Building knowledge, transforming mindsets and shifting social norms, incorporating analysis of gender identity-based inequalities and conflict sensitivity at all points of development and program cycles, promoting inclusion and participation of marginalized women to address root causes of vulnerability, developing national plans, policies, and legislation, disaggregating data, as mentioned previously, collaborating, sharing expertise, so acting as a champion, promoting civil society participation, investing in leadership and capacity building, particularly for human rights claiming. I think it's really important, when we're reverting back to the beginning of the presentation in terms of the people-centered human rights approach. Promoting measures to prevent and address violence against marginalized women and girls, and encourage a transformative agenda for the private sector and in the private sector. I think there are examples here in terms of ethnic and racial discrimination. I won't go through them for the whole slide, but so it's just as an example, so we could address the urgent the urgent things such as the malnutrition, the chronic malnutrition amongst women, children from ethnic groups, and obviously girls are normally the ones that are most disadvantaged when we're looking at the numbers, and reprioritizing spending on basic services, looking at social protection, and so forth and so on. What I'm trying to say, I mean, that's the bottom line before we move to Q&A, is that, you know, we must always strive for a more inclusive world where identity, gender, ethnicity, caste, religion, disability, and other social markers which are not here are no longer a barrier for equal treatment. So I think that's it.
Just to give you a bit of an outline of what I'll be talking about. So I was kind of asked to talk a bit about intersectionality. So I'm going to start by kind of describing what I see as some key elements of intersectionality in terms of the way that I use it in my own research and practice. Then I'll give you some background and kind of context to my research on how intersectionality is understood and used among equality policymakers and equality third sector organizations in England and Scotland. So I'll share some kind of key findings. In particular, I found that there are kind of 5 different concepts of intersectionality in use, each of which have different implications for intersectionally marginalized groups and intersectional justice. So in relation to the gender architecture, I'll focus in on one of these, what I call diversity within and its limitations. So in some ways, this is kind of a how not to do intersectionality presentation, But from this analysis, we can make positive recommendations as to how we might create a more intersectional gender equality architecture in Scotland. Okay. So just to start off with thinking about intersectionality then, intersectionality is a Black feminist theory. So it kind of names Black women's prior theorizing of the social world's foundational organizing logics of white supremacy, gendered racism, and racialized sexism. So it was not developed only in the US. We associate it kind of with the US. It also has a strong tradition here in the UK as well, as the final three references that I have up here kind of attest to. And just to say, when I speak about white supremacy in this presentation, I mean kind of drawing on the work of the philosopher Charles Mills, a kind of global social, political, economic, and cultural system which privileges whiteness and which characterizes Scotland as it does kind of elsewhere as well. So intersectionality is the understanding that social inequalities are interdependent and indivisible from one another. So in the words of Patricia Hill Collins, race, class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, nation, ability, and age operate not as unitary, mutually exclusive entities, but rather as reciprocally constructing phenomena. So Kimberly Crenshaw employed this term to describe the ways that Black women's experiences and identities are marginalized by tendencies to treat race and gender as mutually exclusive categories in anti-discrimination law, feminism, and anti-racist movements, with all kind of focusing on the most powerful or privileged members of groups, so for example, white women, and taking them as representatives of the group as a whole. And although she was writing about the US, I think this analysis is equally true of Scotland and the UK more broadly. So in other words, as Patricia Hill Collins articulated around the same time, systems of oppression are interlocking and interdependent within a matrix of domination. Okay. So you can all see my slides, right, Katie? Yeah. Okay. Yep. So there are kind of many ways of understanding intersectionality, which you've heard about a lot already during this theme year, from the chairs and members of the National Advisory Council on Women and Girls and others. So what I'm going to do is kind of highlight a few points as to how I use it in my research, which I do in order to assess the implications of different concepts of intersectionality for intersectionally marginalized groups and intersectional justice. So first of all, intersectionality involves both individual and structural levels of analysis. And in kind of public discourse about intersectionality, as well as policy and practice, there's really a kind of over-focus on identity and experience. In fact, identities and experiences, both marginalized and privileged ones, are created by the synthesis of inequality structures. So structures including white supremacy, sexism, ableism, cisgenderism, heterosexism, among others. And we can kind of think about it like this synthesis, while it's kind of always happening, I know it's kind of very abstract, we can also think about it that when it comes to thinking about kind of existing people, you and I, to thinking about our social positions, this synthesis kind of already happened. And it's that kind of created the conditions for the identities and experiences that we have. So you kind of can't have identities and experiences without this synthesis of inequality structures. And we must kind of do the work to talk about and understand structures and not only experiences, but it's not easy because yes, it can be very abstract. So secondly, intersectionality is both relational and it's focused on those who are most oppressed. So the inequality structures of which the synthesis that I just mentioned is kind of what intersectionality is, can be thought of as axes of privilege and oppression, which kind of produce our social positions and experiences. So the idea that intersectionality is relational means that along each of these axes, that someone's disadvantage is usually someone else's privilege. So to kind of take the example of white privilege, not everyone can kind of have white privilege. So privilege accorded to one particular racial group, wherein among many other benefits, you kind of see yourself at the center You're kind of positively represented everywhere. You have role models. The official holidays kind of reflect your culture and religion. This is not something which kind of can be redistributed. So not everyone can be the center. There's only one center. And this privileging of whiteness is kind of created by taking something off someone else. And we can make similar observations about white male privilege, and these always, of course, intersect. Given our different positions along all of these different axes, for all of us, our experience is kind of characterized simultaneously by both oppression and privilege in context-dependent ways. So it's not an either or. No one is just wholly oppressed or wholly privileged along all of the axes and in all contexts. One key implication of this, which is really important, is that we all have agency. We all have the kind of the capacity to act for ourselves, which is something that I'll come back to. So we have both privileged and marginal aspects to our kind of complex identities, and our positioning as privileged or oppressed shifts depending on whom or what we are interacting with. At the same time, having said that, some people are certainly more oppressed or more privileged than others. And who this is can be learned through investigation, through empirical research. And those who are kind of most oppressed are really the priority of intersectionality theory and practice. So this kind of means that in a social world, which again is kind of characterized by white supremacy, the priority of intersectionality is kind of not to study or address differences among white women. It also means that in relation to a given issue and in particular context, depending on what we're talking about in terms of inequality, sexism is not always the most kind of relevant axis of inequality. So gender can't be kind of presumed as a focal point. And when gender is a focal point, a relevant axis, it might be men who are disadvantaged, kind of depending on what the issue is. Okay, so you'll have heard before that intersectionality kind of treats inequalities as mutually constitutive and not additive. So that means in the context of thinking about gender equality architecture, because of the synthesis of inequality structures that I spoke about previously, other inequalities are kind of always indivisible from gender, so not just sometimes. And it also means that thinking in terms of multiple identities is not necessarily helpful, because this kind of suggests an additive view. So it's not that we all have multiple identities which can be kind of added and subtracted in different contexts, but rather we have complex identities in which different aspects shape one another and are really indivisible from one another. So there's kind of little value in discussing women or men kind of generically, because gender is shaped by other inequalities, resulting in a specific experience of gender, which is different from others. And the seemingly kind of generic categories of woman and women is in fact, in a social world, again, always shaped by white supremacy, always already socially constructed as white. So this means that it's kind of these words are kind of given the meaning of white and associated with whiteness, whether this is intentional on the part of the speaker or not. Okay, so why is intersectionality important? There's lots of reasons, but I think it's important to keep in mind that ultimately, little progress has been made with a kind of separate single issue approach in terms of achieving equality for the most marginalized. And I think recognition of this is apparent in kind of contemporary racial justice movements, and there's a lot of kind of empirical research on this in the UK, looking at women of color's experiences of austerity, for example. And in fact, the single issue approach has really increased inequalities within and across social groups. So it's created policy privileges for affluent, educated white women. It's really increased inequalities among women. However, much equality work, whether it's policy or practice, remains very siloed, so very kind of separate into different equality strands, which means that it's predominantly focused around single issues and single identities and serves relatively homogeneous and intersectionally privileged groups. Okay. I'm just going to go on to tell you a bit about my research into intersectionality in practice. So just as some kind of a bit of background before I go into some findings. So what I was looking at is how is intersectionality conceptualized and operationalized in the equality third sector and among equality policymakers in England and Scotland. By the equality third sector, I mean organizations that have emerged because of inequality related to markers of identity and which aim to increase equality. So LGBTI rights, racial justice, feminist, disability rights, and refugee organizations, and kind of intersectional combinations of these. So for example, Black women's organizations, LGBTI refugee organizations. And I draw a distinction between this sector, the third sector, and the kind of grassroots. So these organizations have kind of emerged from social movements, but they're now formally constituted and funded and have kind of complicated relationships to social movements. They're not necessarily, they are often on the same page, but they're not necessarily on the same page. And in a context where these organizations have largely been focused on kind of single issues, single identities, I was interested in the kind of how are they understanding this politically transformative idea of intersectionality. So the findings that I will share are based on data collected through case studies of 3 local networks of equality organizations, which are committed to intersectionality, to working intersectionally. In the case studies, I employed mixed qualitative methods, and these were conducted between about 2016 and 2018. And the specific organizations and equality networks that I worked with in cities where I conducted the research are anonymized. So just to kind of, this research really happened in a particular context, one aspect of which is debates not only in intersectionality studies, but also popular culture about kind of white appropriation of intersectionality from Black feminism, from women of color feminism, and Indigenous feminism, or in other words, kind of colonization of intersectionality. So as a white woman, it's important for me to contextualize what kind of led me to this project. I guess my key point of entry was really working as a practitioner in the equality third sector. So in a Black-led LGBTQ organization in London for a number of years, an organization that thought a lot about intersectionality, although that wasn't necessarily the term we would have used. And kind of coming from the same sector that I study also means that I'm kind of complicit with and implicated in much of my kind of analysis to follow. And a kind of related debate in intersectionality studies and popular culture is kind of controversy around the use of both the term and the idea of intersectionality to talk about inequalities other than those positioning women of color. So in the policy and third sector environment here in Scotland, in contrast, as well as in England, but I'll obviously focus on Scotland, intersectionality tends to be used in an unspecified way across all 9 protected characteristics in the Equality Act 2010. And in terms of thinking about architecture, this kind of unified equality law and the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which obviously replaced separate commissions for race, gender, and disability, this kind of unification creates both opportunities and challenges for intersectionality. So it creates opportunities in kind of bringing different equality strands together, whereas previously they were legislated for separately. It creates opportunities to consider interactions between them. But within the Act itself, they are still kind of considered separately. And the provision for dual discrimination, which was really lobbied for by equality third sector organizations, feminist organizations, among others, has not been brought into force because of decision-making at Westminster, not here in Scotland. And some groups are not specifically recognized in the Equality Act, so notably refugees. Sex workers is another group that's not recognized. So there are kind of limitations to the Equality Act. And in Scotland, gender-specific measures which have developed since the Equality Act, wherein women are treated kind of relatively homogeneously. So for example, the Gender Representation on Public Boards Scotland Act of 2018 kind of sits somewhat uncomfortably alongside interest in intersectionality. And gender mainstreaming, which is an approach which forms part of the gender architecture here in Scotland, and intersectionality are not necessarily kind of complementary approaches. So if gender continues to be a privileged focal point, it's not ultimately intersectionality, but kind of a step in between the two, kind of single issue and an intersectional approach. And recent research on this in the Canadian context, where they've been trialing gender-based analysis plus, quote unquote, has kind of highlighted this. Intersectionality is, however, really growing in popularity here in Scotland, and this popularity is evidenced by this webinar we're having today and this theme year for the National Advisory Council on Women and Girls. So my research was really interested in this context. Yes, it's popular, but what does it mean? How is it used, and in whose kind of interests? And my analysis of both English and Scottish equality policy documents, which formed one component of the research, found really a lot of different definitions of intersectionality, all of which were decontextualized from its origins in Black feminist theory, and that its use within the document was kind of largely individualized, so kind of descriptive, additive, and superficial. I also found that meaningful engagement with race and the intersection of race and gender as kind of central categories of intersectionality theory was really lacking in policy documents not specifically concerning race equality. And austerity is another important kind of context in the policy and third sector environment, which I won't have a lot of time to go into now, but which I explore elsewhere. Okay, so my kind of key overall findings, I'll share these with you quickly before going specifically into how these relate to the gender architecture. So as I mentioned, there are kind of 5 different concepts of intersectionality that I found to be used in third sector equality organizing as well as equality policy. And I found that operationalizing intersectionality is kind of fundamentally about representation, so kind of who is represented, but also whether and how to represent others, and coalition and solidarity. And this kind of coinciding with other research as well. And I found that conflicts in each of these kind of areas of representation and coalition are kind of driven by competing understandings of intersectionality. I argued that applying intersectionality requires a focus on both issues which are common to different equality strands and intersectionally marginalized identities, including kind of newer ones. So for instance, non-binary identities is one which the gender architecture really kind of needs to contend with. And this contending involves a recognition of kind of, again, thinking about inequality structures, the interrelationship between cisgenderism and sexism, which really kind of calls for a reconceptualization of gender, and for many of us that have it, an acknowledgement of cisgender privilege. And equality organizations, practitioners, and policymakers can kind of work to build greater unity through developing shared understandings of intersectionality. And kind of ultimately a challenge of intersectionality is to kind of balance acting in solidarity while kind of prioritizing the agency of those that we're acting in solidarity with. So I'll just tell you a bit about these 5 concepts. Just to say that I'm not saying that all of these are intersectionality, but these are different meanings given to intersectionality by equality third sector organizations, practitioners, and policymakers. The first of these is generic intersectionality, in which there's really no focus on any equality strand or strands in particular. The same work is delivered to benefit all, and applying intersectionality is thought to be addressing issues that affect everybody. This concept is really kind of found in the overlap between some policymakers, the public sector, and the third sector. I found it among kind of white and privileged participants, and interestingly, those who kind of learned intersectionality in academic environments. So some kind of implications of this concept, it obviously kind of empties intersectionality of its attention to power and marginality. Within it, work on issues that affect the most disadvantaged is actually viewed as being kind of not intersectional and like a bit out of date. It's been used in some local contexts against the racial justice sector in particular, and to kind of displace attention to race. And this displacement kind of strengthens the association of other inequalities and the sectors working on them with kind of whiteness. Racial justice organizations are viewed by some with this idea of intersectionality as kind of uniquely incapable of doing intersectionality, which has kind of real material consequences for them, while white-led organizations obviously benefit from this idea, since then they're viewed as kind of uniquely capable of intersectionality. The second concept is pan-equality intersectionality, so addressing issues that affect all or most marginalized equality groups. This concept facilitates a kind of more structural understanding of intersectionality, but it potentially flattens differences and precludes work on issues that are not kind of perceived to be common. The third is multi-strand intersectionality, which is addressing equality strands in parallel, separately and simultaneously. So this is a really kind of common meaning given to intersectionality. This understanding of it is kind of additive. Within it, intersectionality is reduced to diversity, and it effaces intersectional marginalization or the kind of crossover of equality strands. The fourth concept is diversity within. So this is addressing intersections within an equality strand where one particular inequality is viewed as more important than others. This was the most prevalent applied concept of intersectionality among those in the women's sector within my sample and those working on gender policy. This wasn't the case for any other kind of single strand sector, so refugee, racial justice, disabled, deaf, or LGBTI, nor was it prevalent in among intersectional organizations. It was found among those with mainly dominant aspects to their identities, and it was really learned within organizations within the third sector and from policymakers. I'm going to talk a lot more about this, but ultimately it's kind of unable to incorporate this idea of the synthesis of inequality structures, which produces both privilege and penalty. And then finally, what we might kind of more readily recognize as intersectionality, work of and with specific groups sharing intersecting identities, where no particular inequality is thought to be more important than the other. So this was the most prevalent understanding within intersectional organizations. So for Black and minority ethnic women's organizations, disabled women's organizations, etc. But there are challenges in practice for this concept as well. So here again, intersectionality is often individualized. There are challenges of accounting for kind of all markers of inequality within a particular project or organization. And this kind of understanding of intersectionality is viewed by some policymakers as kind of niche, having few beneficiaries, and therefore kind of not value for money. Okay, so I'm going to go on to focus on diversity within, but just to say before I do that while this is based on research in both Scotland and England, the analysis that kind of follows is as true of Scotland as of England. So in fact, within my sample, this concept of intersectionality was actually more prevalent in Scotland. And it's a particular understanding of intersectionality, which has historically been championed by influential actors kind of within and out with the Scottish government. It's kind of identified with and originating within the women's sector. But given that the women's sector has a kind of privileged relationship with government as compared with other equality sectors, it kind of really now affects all equality policy and practice in Scotland. And I'm kind of focusing on this because it's very relevant to thinking about the current gender equality architecture and to ways in which it can be made to be more intersectional. And I feel that learning from the third sector, which is predominantly who my research was with, is absolutely critical to creating a more intersectional gender equality architecture. So diversity within, so I have a quote up here. It's thinking about intersectionality as the further complications, the further disadvantages and discrimination that you can experience if you fall into more than one group. So this is how intersectionality is often addressed within kind of single issue organizations. So for instance, kind of white-led and predominantly white women's organizations, not only women's organizations, but in particular, and single issue policymaking machineries. So ultimately, it kind of manifests in inclusion projects targeted at intersectionally marginalized groups. And this isn't the only way to do intersectionality in single issue organizations by any means. So it's not that all single strand organizations do it this way, but for some that do, attention to intersectionality is sometimes driven by kind of funder requirements. So as a quality monitoring of service users that kind of reveals exclusions of people from services and activities, and not necessarily from the organization itself. So sometimes organizations are a bit reluctant to think about intersectionality. And going back to the kind of key elements of intersectionality that I spoke about at the beginning, so this understanding of intersectionality is kind of necessarily additive because gender is viewed as more important than other inequalities. So other inequalities are kind of in the picture sometimes, but they can also be kind of subtracted at will. They're thought to be relevant sometimes, but not all the time. It kind of pertains to an individual level of analysis, neglecting the synthesis of structures of inequality, since again, it views one gender in particular as kind of fundamental. It views groups as kind of solely oppressed or privileged along the most important axis, which is gender, and belonging to other equality strands is usually thought about as kind of additional barriers in a deficit model. It does not necessarily focus on those who are most disadvantaged, since the primary inequality of gender is predefined. Okay, so I know that this has been a bit abstract so far, so I'm going to illustrate this with an example. So I looked at 3 different projects addressing violence against disabled women across England and Scotland. These projects were all kind of identified as intersectional by participants, and they all aimed broadly at increasing disabled women's use of and access to violence against women and girls services, responding to the exclusion of disabled women from these services. So these services were not kind of set up with disabled women in mind originally. In the 2 projects operating from a kind of diversity within understanding of intersectionality, having representation of disabled women among those running and directing the project was kind of viewed as a bonus, but not a necessity. So this is kind of inclusion without representation. So including people as members or service users or constituents without representation among those running the organization or project. Because disabled women were kind of viewed as having additional barriers, enabling their kind of participation and agency, their capacity to act, was not viewed as kind of central to the project. For similar reasons, when disabled women were involved, they were expected to give up their time for free in kind of consultative or advisory roles or similar. Because gender was viewed as the kind of fundamental inequality, there was not necessarily any outreach or relationship building with the disabled people sector in project development and implementation. There was no attention to other inequalities within the project because this is an additive understanding of intersectionality. The focus of the projects was on building capacity of non-disabled women's organizations to serve disabled women. So this is kind of acting for disabled women or doing to them, which kind of fails to take into account their agency. Disabled women were kind of viewed as not really having the capacity to act for themselves because they're multiply marginalized. So in the project that kind of was associated with more of an intersections of equality strands concept of intersectionality. In contrast, it really aspired to be disabled women survivor-led as a core guiding principle. So it aspired to equitable representation of disabled women and their participation, and this was viewed as very important. Disabled women participants in this project advocated for their participation in developing and implementing the project to be remunerated as expertise. So they weren't willing to give up their time for free. Building relationships with the disabled people sector in developing and implementing the project was viewed as very important from the outset. So the project kind of grew out of conversations among the disabled peoples and women's sectors. It was the only project of the three to kind of centrally involve women of color and integrate consideration of race, sexuality, and trans status, along with gender and disability. So kind of consistent with a mutually constitutive rather than an additive understanding of intersectionality. And in contrast to kind of focusing on capacity building non-disabled women's organizations, this project was really about developing disabled women-led peer support services. Okay, so this was kind of one example of many projects targeted towards particular intersectionally marginalized groups that I found in my research. I found very few projects among single-issue white-led organizations of any sectors that worked specifically around race, interestingly. So in fact, in Scotland, women's organizations in receipt of Scottish government funding for violence against women and girls services have been kind of mandated to have trans inclusion plans, which, while absolutely essential and important, does kind of raise the question of why trans inclusion only? Why not a similar requirement to kind of be anti-racist and to represent women of color's interests? And I'll kind of come back to that point. Some organizations kind of offer problematic kind of cultural narratives, kind of ultimately a bit racist narratives, which they use to rationalize why particular minority ethnic groups will not engage with them, which just kind of relieves them of kind of responsibility to acknowledge and address white supremacy. Because diversity within is kind of an additive view of intersectionality, projects are often thought about separately. So for example, a women's organization might have a disabled project and a Black, Asian, and minority ethnic project, but these can be kind of managed separately within the organization. Whereas if we kind of view inequalities as being mutually constitutive, race can kind of never be left out of a disability project, and disability can never be left out of a race project. So projects can be kind of thought about as kind of service delivery to the hard to reach with like little thought to agency or kind of structural change. And when representation of intersectionally marginalized people is kind of thought just as service users or constituents, but not meaningfully in decision making, this kind of implicitly instructs the more privileged group member as the one really capable of knowing about and doing intersectionality. So the question that we have to ask about kind of inclusion and applications of intersectionality more broadly is, what kind of participation of intersectionally marginalized people is kind of deemed essential? Is it just participation in activities, or is it decision making about what these activities are? We also have to ask to what extent kind of community leadership of projects is really possible in organizations and policy structures that are not actually governed by the target group of inclusion, but rather by people who are privileged in relation to them. So we also need to ask whether inclusion in governance, where it does exist, is valued in the form of being remunerated or not. Can I just check the time, Katie?
Got like 3 minutes left, but it's quite flexible.
Okay. Okay, so I've kind of spoken a bit about the problems about diversity within. Ultimately, this concept of intersectionality can kind of manifest in discrimination from some equality sectors and communities towards others. It kind of serves to further the interests of singularly disadvantaged groups, But kind of outside of this discourse, intersectionally marginalized women, intersectionally marginalized people really organize to represent themselves. So they're not kind of waiting around for single issue organizations and policy structures to kind of get it right. Okay, so I'll end with some thoughts on what we can kind of learn from this in terms of creating an intersectional gender architecture here in Scotland. I emphasize that learning from the third sector is really critical. And I mean, in particular, intersectional organizations. And there's also relevant and valuable intersectionality expertise in other equality sectors. So not just the kind of feminist or women's sector, but the racial justice, LGBTI, disability rights, and refugee sectors. And really intersectional organizations kind of present kind of a model for thinking about how we do intersectionality. So what I kind of suggest is that what we can do is be very specific about what we mean by intersectionality, and to really advocate for intersections of equality strands and pan-equality concepts to the exclusion of generic multi-strand and diversity within ones. Policymakers can fund intersectional organizations and alliances. By alliances, I mean kind of equitable partnerships between different equality subsectors. So, for instance, the women's and trans sectors, and remunerate them as kind of policy partners, so value their expertise and participation. Single strand organizations can kind of critically examine the kind of concepts of intersectionality which they use and make space for self-organization of intersectionally marginalized groups. So rather than kind of focusing on how single issue organizations and policy structures can kind of better include intersectionally marginalized women and people more widely, we need to more clearly ask the question of how these groups are already organizing and representing themselves and kind of pay attention to what they're saying. We can also build greater unity and kind of coalition working around issues which are common to different equality strands and kind of in solidarity with one another, while highlighting and prioritizing intersectionally marginalized experiences and leadership. So just in conclusion then, so different applied concepts of intersectionality serve different interests. Intersections of equality strands concepts are kind of associated with intersectionally marginalized people and organizations representing them. And there's a pressing need, as I mentioned, for us to be more specific about which concept of intersectionality we're using when we speak of intersectionality. Approaches that always privilege gender as the primary inequality are arguably necessarily additive kind of diversity within approaches. I spoke about the expertise of intersectional organizations and other equality sectors, and I kind of ultimately suggest that given that intersectionality is given so many meanings in equality practice and policy, it's kind of not sufficient to state that we are intersectional, or that the gender architecture is intersectional. We perhaps need to be thinking in terms of intersectional justice and what that might look like. And I'll end there. Thank you.
I just want to begin by saying one other note of thanks to you all with respect to organizing or just continuing to think about intersectional gender architecture, especially during this time. Now, it's a difficult time. It's an incredibly difficult time during the pandemic, and we could all perhaps think of, conceive of, and address the pandemic as primarily a healthcare crisis. But it's been increasingly clear. In fact, it's been clear since the pandemic sort of hit and the way that it has unraveled, that it's essentially an equality crisis. And those who are in fact severely and severely disadvantaged, people who suffer multiple or intersectional discrimination, have been at the receiving end, have been the worst losers, so to say, in the pandemic. So I think keeping to focus, or keeping to the agenda of creating an intersectional gender architecture matters not just in any time, but particularly in this time because of what we're facing. So thank you so much for organizing it during this time in particular, and for having me say a few words on it. What are you going to hear today? Essentially, I'll be talking about two things. One is I will be answering the question on how shall we create an intersectional gender architecture. And I think you can conceive of this question in many planes or registers. You can think about creating an intersectional gender architecture in policy, which I believe you all can do better than I can. I'm an academic, I'm a discrimination lawyer, and I think my intervention today would be limited to how do we create an intersectional gender architecture in law in particular. By that I mean hard law, law as it enacted by the legislature, and law as declared and enforced by the courts. I'll say a bit more about why that should be at the forefront of creating an intersectional gender architecture, because I think that's where intersectionality has seeped the least in the last couple of years. Intersectionality has been popular in the popular discourse. That seems ironic. If at the top of any societal legal architecture is law in terms of constitutional or public law, and that doesn't incorporate intersectionality, then I think there's very little policy intervention that can really truly help. I think we'll have to tackle the basis on which law is organized in the society, and I think we'd have to think about specific legal interventions. The second thing I want to say is when I say incorporating an intersectional gender architecture, what do I really mean by intersectionality? I may be preaching to the choir here. I know the circle members all have some idea of intersectionality. Everyone has a foot in the door when we think of intersectionality. So I'll be pitching it at a level where everyone has some sense of what intersectionality means in terms of their ontological lived experience, but also theoretically. I will be specifically talking about a definition that I have mentioned in my book on intersectionality, trying to collate almost 30 years of intersectionality scholarship and bringing that definition together, and why that makes a difference in thinking about intersectionality. And I'll be closing with 5 myths about intersectionality. So a bit of myth busting exercise, what intersectionality is not. So that's what we're going to do today. But I want to just begin by saying again why it matters to think about intersectional gender architecture in law. So let's go back to the history of intersectionality. Think about where has the term come from, and what does it do? So the term, as many of us would know, was coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. She's a fellow academic. She gave the field a name which seemed to have existed for over 200 years. So you can trace back intersectionality thought in the early 1800s back to Black feminist movement in the United States, where Black women were at the forefront fighting not just racism and slavery, but were also fighting their exclusion from the feminist movement. And those interventions from people like Maria Stewart, Anna Julia Cooper, show us that the thinking of thinking which is intersectionality-like existed, even if the word or the term intersectionality didn't. But what Kimberly Crenshaw did in 1989, in fact, in 1988, when she delivered the speech, which became the famous article demarginalizing the intersection of race and sex, she was giving the phenomenon a name, something which Black feminists had always worked on and thought about and campaigned with. Right, so intersectionality had existed before this period in time in 1989, but it didn't exist with the trope intersectionality. Now, here's the interesting part. Kimberly Crenshaw was writing specifically as a discrimination lawyer. She was writing about intersectionality not simply as a matter of what Black women face, but what they face within the legal system. That it's one thing to face discrimination, which is intersectional in nature, because you're both Black and a woman, so on the basis of both race and sex, and that such discrimination is different from racism simpliciter or sexism simpliciter. It's one thing to just know that idea. But she was saying that this discrimination is lost in discrimination law. So in Title VII in the US, which is their major employment discrimination statute, she said that discrimination law had no tools to deal with such discrimination. That people in the US, when they were, say, dismissed from their job for being Black women, they had no way to challenge this because they either had to choose being Black or being a woman as the ground of discrimination. But their discrimination fell through the cracks of both racism and sexism because it wasn't just either, it was both of them at the same time. Here's the interesting part then, that 31 years on, discrimination law or law as a site of intervention remains beyond reach in intersectionality. So while the term intersectionality has become popular everywhere in the world, economists are using it, sociologists work with it, anthropologists know it so well, they study intersectionality, people in the popular discourse use it. So Twitter is completely full of people using the hashtag, from Beyonce to Hillary Clinton, from presidential campaigns to climate change. Everybody in popular discourse is sort of plugging into the language of intersectionality. Yet, the site of its origin when intersectionality was coined remains completely inaccessible. I'm a comparative lawyer. I work on laws across the world, US, UK, South Africa, India, Canada, EU, ECHR, all of these laws. None of them have a way of acknowledging intersectionality. Normally, you would have a law which says, no one shall be discriminated on grounds of race, sex, religion, sexual orientation, but you would never see, or you would very rarely see, other than South Africa perhaps, an explicit recognition that discrimination can be based or inequality can be based on more than one ground, that inequality is exacerbated when it happens on the basis of two or more personal characteristics of identities. You're almost beating your head against the wall when it comes to law. So how is it that in the popular discourse, intersectionality has been so prevalent everywhere? It's omnipresent now. And that somehow in law, intersectionality has seeped through the cracks. So this is what I try to address in two of my books, Intersectional Discrimination and Intersectionality in Human Rights Law, which tries to see how intersectionality can be realized both in discrimination law and in human rights law generally. So for those of you who might be interested, it might be useful to see exactly what are the tools in law to be especially litigating on the basis of intersectionality. Say if you have a client or if there's somebody who would like to work with to bring an intersectional claim, what are the hurdles and how can we overcome those? In particular, my book, Intersectional Discrimination from Oxford University Press last year goes through what can we do in bringing these claims at courts, specifically employment tribunals and such. And the book goes through the labyrinth of discrimination law in particular and says exactly what needs to be done when you go through each of the hoops in discrimination law. How do we choose grounds? How do we know whether something is direct or indirect discrimination? What is the burden of proof? What kind of statistical evidence is required? What kind of affirmative action or positive action provisions are needed? That kind of thing is what the book provides. But what I want to do today is specifically offer a more broad-based, a diverse legal intervention, not just to do with what can we do at courts and what can we do in discrimination law, but how do we realize intersectionality in law per se? And I think the answer is three-pronged, and elaborate on the three prongs in just a moment. But just to say, we're thinking about triple tracking intersectionality or intersectional discrimination legislation. So every time you're thinking about intersectionality, you have to ask, where in general legislation is it located? Do the acts or statutes which our parliaments pass, is the Scottish Parliament considering intersectionality? If it's not, why not? And if not, then how can we ask for language which is intersectional in nature to be added to general legislation? I'll give an example in just a moment. The second prong is to think about how is intersectionality incorporated in equality and human rights legislation, in fact. So thinking about Equality Act 2010 in particular. And the third thing to think about is, how do specific equality and human rights legislation deal with intersectionality? Right, so if you imagine the legal architecture in legislation as three-pronged, right? There's general legislation, which has nothing to do with equality or human rights per se. Then there is very general equality and human rights legislation, such as Equality Act and Human Rights Act. Then there's finally very specific equality and human rights legislation. There are three kinds of legislation, if we imagine. We have to ask how we can have intersectionality incorporated in those legislations. But why is it important? So let me give you a very general example where we have missed intersectionality. Consider the Coronavirus Scotland Act 2020. The Act under Section 6 has this obligation on the ministers to have due regard to the opportunities to advance equality and discrimination. But the Act doesn't mention anywhere that equality and discrimination is related to specific protected characteristics. But more importantly, the Act doesn't acknowledge that protected characteristics can combine to exacerbate the experience of discrimination. This is problematic because the way coronavirus has unfolded, the way the pandemic has unfolded, it's become clear that it doesn't impact everyone equally. So if we are addressing the impact of a pandemic, we have to think about who does it impact the most. When we think about who it impacts the most, we have to think about those disadvantaged, and those disadvantaged the most perhaps, or in comparison with others. So inequality in the case of coronavirus has been exacerbated when it is based on personal characteristics, such as race, sex, religion, but also that when all of these characteristics combine, say in the case of Black Muslim women, or women who are pregnant, or Black women who are pregnant, or disabled women, all of these combination of characteristics have a particularly debilitating impact in terms of who gets coronavirus, in terms of how easily they are exposed to virus based on their living conditions, or how easily they can access any kind of healthcare system, so just treatment or even just being tested for coronavirus, in terms of their long-term possibilities of emerging from the virus, whether they get to retain their jobs, whether they have security, whether their families get to recover from coronavirus, even if they're not impacted by the virus per se. All of these interventions, which the Coronavirus Scotland Act tries to talk about, all of them depend on who it's targeting. But without doing much about acknowledging that the impact of the virus or pandemic is in fact intersectional in nature, we have done nothing to actually, first of all, causally think about what causes that impact to be differentiated, that actually not everybody is impacted at the same time. And we do nothing about addressing that either. So we neither acknowledge nor redress intersectionality. This is at the most general level. Even where you know that public policy doesn't have something which is particularly intersectional in nature. So you're not framing public policy which is about, about disabled women per se. It's a general legislative policy. Even that policy has a very specific intersectional impact. This matters because pandemic has not hit everyone equally. And if we have to address the pandemic, the underlying structures of inequality have to be grappled with. So if we have to ask, how does general legislation deal with intersectionality, we have to see how we spell out intersectionality within the terms of the legislation, that we say that inequality and discrimination happen on the basis of a combination of identities, and to list those identities of personal characteristics. I just want to mention 3 things with respect to the specific case of Equality Act 2010. Intersectionality seems to have fallen by the wayside of Equality Act 2010 from the moment that it was enacted. In 2010, the passing of the Equality Act was a bit of a euphoric moment, because intersectionality was at least mentioned as a case of combination discrimination under Section 14 of the Equality Act. And we were sanguine and optimistic that this provision would be brought into force. Even though that provision was limited to just 2 grounds of discrimination, there was a possibility that the government would consider at least bringing this into force. In 2013, the government announced that it's never going to bring this provision into force. It's not been brought into force in Scotland either. And the reason for that has been that the government seems to think that litigating intersectionality, or allowing people to claim that they've been intersectionally discriminated, would be very expensive. That's the official reason, and that's the reason for which it's not been adopted. I think greater push to having this provision enacted, enforced, and functional for people who face intersectional discrimination would be the key step to building an architecture. It's the framework, it's the basic framework, it's at the root of the architecture which we can build to acknowledge that intersectional discrimination happens within the specific Equality Act, that this is a matter of Equality Act to address, and then to do something about addressing it in terms of opening up our judicial system to intersectional claims. I also want to mention 2 other provisions of the Equality Act, which are key to working with an intersectional gender architecture. One is thinking about socioeconomic inequalities as key to understanding intersectionality. Intersectionality is not simply about identity theory. It's not simply about how we experience the world, but it's about how we experience discrimination and disadvantage. It's a radical theory of disadvantage. And socioeconomic inequality, redistributive inequality is at the heart of it, because it disadvantages us in some way. So thinking about how redistributive socioeconomic inequalities interact with identities and personal characteristics listed under our law is key to appreciating the dynamic of intersectionality. This has been done in Scotland to an extent, because Section 1 has been now brought into force. It's not been brought into force in England and Wales, but because Scotland is already ahead in terms of having brought into force Section 1 to the limited extent that it has, it'll be key to bring intersectionality closer to working with socioeconomic inequalities, to look at, in particular, the impact of poverty and class through Section 1 and Section 14 at the same time. I also want to mention public sector equality duty, which all of us work with so closely, that all public authorities are obligated in the United Kingdom to exercise their functions with respect to, with due regard to eliminating discrimination, advancing equality of opportunity, and fostering good relations between people. That's a good enough duty, but it's not intersectional in nature. If we think about eliminating discrimination, which is simply based on race, we will probably only be addressing discrimination which Black men face or which Indian men face. We wouldn't possibly be thinking about how women of color in particular face discrimination, or how we advance equality of opportunity for those who are multiply disadvantaged. The public sector equality duty, either in its legislated form or in the guidance, needs to be pushed to be cast in intersectional terms in particular. I don't think it'll ever be enough to say that we eliminate discrimination, advance equality of opportunity, or foster good relations on single axis ground. So simply on the basis of one ground at a time. Intersectionality would always fall through the cracks. So all of these duties, which are framed only as single axis duties, that you need to think about gender in one box and then race in one box, need to be thought about as thinking about both gender and race, or disability, race and gender, or sexual orientation, gender reassignment, or disability at the same time, right? So we have to think of inequality as existing in clusters, not in silos, but it has to be done specifically in either the text of the legislation or in the guidance in terms of how we actually do our job in terms of being public authorities or public bodies. And those are the three key things that I want to mention with respect to Equality Act in terms of thinking about how something as innovative as Equality Act 2010 is still quite a rudimentary or a basic legislation when it comes to intersectionality, and how we need to continue to push law reform to recognize intersectionality in its text and to redress it then in its legal mechanisms. I want to give a last example of a specific law or a specific equality and human rights law and how that should capture intersectionality. Take the case of the Modern Slavery Act 2015. Now, again, like Equality Act 2010, it's one of the modern legislations in the country. We are talking about legislation which has been crafted very well in terms of covering all its bases of what the problem is. So thinking about slavery, exploitation, servitude, sexual exploitation, exploitative labor, all of these have been particularly talked of in the Modern Slavery Act, and the Modern Slavery Act is directed towards these particular problems. But here's the missing element in the Act, that it never acknowledges at any point that modern slavery doesn't just happen on its own, but it happens because certain groups are particularly vulnerable to modern slavery. The significance of thinking about modern slavery in gendered, in class-based, or in disability-related terms is completely lost in the Modern Slavery Act. But what's even more significant is that oftentimes most of these disadvantages work in tandem, they work together. So disabled women, especially women with psychosocial disabilities or mental health issues, have a particularly vulnerable life or circumstance which puts them in a position to be in conditions of exploitation or servitude. There's something about the specific interaction of gender and disability in that context, in the way that disabled women do not get safety nets around them to be protecting them from these exploitative mechanisms, that they fall prey to modern slavery. It's the same for women of color or immigrant women specifically, that there's certain sections of the society who are more prone to modern slavery. This is a specifically intersectional issue. It's a causal issue in the sense that even though we want to address modern slavery, we haven't quite causally understood what causes it, right? So in terms of the legal idea of causation, if something leads to, what is the reason for something leading to something, has not been recognized. So thinking about specific legislations which are to do with human rights law, and thinking about how they are being caused by intersectional structures or systems of discrimination, helps actually address root causes of human rights violations. If our legislations are crafted without an appreciation of where the problem is coming from, so in the ignorance of systems of discrimination or disadvantage, we're doing very little in actually thinking about human rights or improving the rights of women per se. So it'll be specifically useful at the third level and in the three-pronged approach to think about how exactly do human rights legislations incorporate intersectionality in terms of appreciating that human rights violations happen on an intersectional basis, especially for women who are intersectionally disadvantaged. The acknowledgement of that would be significant in terms of crafting policy around it, in terms of looking at specific vulnerable groups to address that intersectional disadvantage. So I have almost front-loaded giving you the answer to what I think requires intersectional gender architecture in law to be imagined and to be constituted. The three-pronged approach should help us think about where the gaps are in legislations, whether they are general legislations, whether it's just the Equality Act or the Human Rights Act, or it's very specific legislation like the Modern Slavery Act. But I haven't quite told you what I think intersectionality is and what do I mean by intersectionality when I say intersectionality. So in the last section, I just want to go through with you the definition of intersectionality, because it matters for us to have a firm grasp of intersectionality when we say intersectionality. And I have before you on the screen two definitions on the left and the right. The National Council's definition is to the left. I've just picked it up from your work. And I've highlighted that the definition of intersectionality therein thinks of intersectionality as a framework to do with multiple categories of identity, which interact and create systems of oppression and power. Now that's a fantastic starting point. I want to expand on this definition to think about what exactly is the framework. What are these categories and how do they interact? And what are these complex systems of oppression and power that we are talking about? So in my work, and specifically my book on intersectionality, I've offered this definition going through 30 years of intersectionality literature, incorporating in it all the different definitions which have been written about in sociology, law, in discrimination law particular, and come up with what is a very mouthy definition. But I want to take you through step by step what the 5 key elements of this definition are. So I'll say the definition out loud and let's go through the 5 key elements of what makes up intersectionality or intersectional discrimination. So intersectionality illuminates the dynamic of sameness and difference and patterns of group disadvantage based on multiple identities understood as a whole and in their full and relevant context with the purpose of redressing and transforming them. Let's break it down. The first and the most key thing about intersectionality is that it illuminates the dynamic of sameness and difference. The simplest, although not the most accurate way of thinking about intersectionality, but it would do, or it would suffice for our purposes today, is to think of intersectionality as a Venn diagram. When, say, 2 spheres of race and sex intersect, the portion in the middle, when 2 spheres are intersecting, is what is defining intersectionality in terms of that portion shows some characteristics of both the spheres of sexism and racism, but it also shows some portion which is unique to itself. And that dynamic of showing both of these characteristics, that portion is having both characteristics which are similar to racism and sexism, but also characteristics which are its own of racism and sexism combined, is what intersectionality is. So intersectionality is not simply about the analogy with either sexism or racism. We know that. But importantly, intersectionality is also not something too unique. It is a part of sexism and racism. So what Black women face as sexism is a part of sexism per se. Their sexism cannot be taken completely out of the box of sexism and thought about as a category of its own. It's a category which is created or co-constituted, as we say in intersectionality theory, by sexism and racism at the same time. It shows features which are neither too different so that they're siloed of its own and to be understood completely different from all other forms of discrimination, but they have something unique so that they be understood as something of its own. And the emphasis on both sameness and difference at the same time is what is unique about intersectionality. It's not saying that this is discrimination which no other person ever faces. It says that this is similar to a lot of other forms of discrimination, but it's also different on its own at the same time. The emphasis on both of them at the same time, I repeat, is the key to intersectionality. The second most important thing about this dynamic is the emphasis on patterns of group disadvantage. This is key when we think about systems of oppression or power. When we think of patterns, the word patterns, as one of the leading theorists in discrimination law describes, we're thinking of patterns which are abiding, substantive, and which are going through a complete pervasive system of discrimination. So they're abiding in the sense that discrimination isn't just a sporadic event. Discrimination or inequality, which is intersectional in nature, has been carrying on for several decades, if not more, for groups which are vulnerable, right? So they're not sporadic events. This is not episodic discrimination. This is entrenched in terms of the time that it's existed. It's substantial, so it's not a small thing, but it affects your life chances per se. It's not simply a case of being dismissed from your work because you wore a pink shirt and your employer doesn't like pink shirts. So you can find employment in another company where people like pink shirts. That's just that's a form of disadvantage per se, but it's not substantial in nature. It's substantial in the sense that systematically or systemically, employers view certain kinds of identities, or systems or structures are organized in such a way, whether in education or employment, that intersectional groups find it hard to include or be included or to have their life chances improved. So it's pervasive, it's substantial, and it's abiding. That's what patterns are. These are motives which replicate, which are existing, and they can't simply be done away with without thinking about policy or law in transformative terms. So you have to change an entire structure in the way we think about law, rights, and human rights to change how intersectional discrimination is understood and redressed. Importantly, this is about group disadvantage. Disadvantage is defined broadly, whether you think it in terms of stereotyping, prejudice, about demeaning, about dignity, in any way that you define disadvantage. We are particularly thinking about disadvantage in intersectionality theory. It's not a theory of privilege, and it's particularly interested in forms of dispossession, what people are not having and why certain others are having access to what we call in law a better life. So if your access to a good life is inhibited, you're being disadvantaged. And it is these concrete form of redistributive or recognition-based disadvantages that we're thinking about. Then we're thinking about multiple identities, but we're thinking of them as a whole. And this is the significant part, that whenever you think of intersectionality, say in the case of poor Black women, you're thinking of their class or poverty, their race and sex at the same time. You can't disentangle these identities, and you can't talk of them as a mush either. You're talking of them as having integrity or as a whole. And you have to think about thinking about things as a whole, particularly in the context of disability law, where the idea of integrity is particularly significant. You're thinking about integrity in the form of not thinking of disabled lives or intersectional lives as incomplete, as deficient, as somehow lacking. You're thinking of intersectional lives just as you think of disabled life as complete, as somehow explanatory of the world around them, as having something significant to say about their experience as a whole. Intersectionality has to be considered in context, but most importantly, identities have to be considered in full and relevant context. What I mean by this is simply that, to give you an example, for those of you who may have read Chimamanda Adichie's Americana, she said that her heroine Ifemelu, when she traveled from Nigeria to the US, she suddenly became Black. And that's a matter of context, right? Ifemelu as a Black woman was not Black woman in Nigeria, where she came from. She became Black in the United States. And intersectionality is significant to be seen as relevant only in the context. So if Scotland is working with the idea of caste or lower caste people from South Asia, Scotland would have to be thinking about how do we think of caste in a context where people have immigrated. Is caste the same as caste in India, or is it different? And these kind of contextual questions have to be taken into account so that ideas or impressions about things as basic as race are not simply lifted out of context. Race assumes a specific character, and its character determines the kind of disadvantages people face. The last thing to remember about intersectionality is that all of this fuss about thinking about intersectionality is about transforming the structures of disadvantage that intersectionality reveals. We need to change the patterns of group disadvantage, and change them not in the sense of tinkering with them, but overhauling the complete structure of disadvantage, right? So intersectionality is radical in its aims, to put it simply. It's not an unambitious theory. It's a theory which really helps us think outside of the box and think about doing something quite significant about dismantling the structures of disadvantage for good. That's what intersectionality is. Those are the 5 key elements of intersectionality and intersectionality theory as it has developed over the last 200 years, but particularly in the last 30 to 40 years where intersectionality has been thriving. I just want to end this talk by going over 5 myths around intersectionality, and that will be the quick myth buster round. So what is intersectionality not about? First thing, the first myth actually is that it's all about Black women. It's true that the intellectual discourse of intersectionality, especially the word intersectionality, has been particularly coined in the context and has developed in Black feminist literature in the United States. But if we read that literature closely, Black women have time and again insisted that intersectionality theory is not simply all about them. It's a theory which is about disadvantage, and Black women have used themselves as a starting point to illuminate how others too may be facing similar kinds of intersectional disadvantage. I always find it useful to remember the National Coalition for Black Women's epithet or motto, which is lifting as we climb. So Black women want to imagine using intersectionality to lift those below them, and everybody thinking in terms of what can we do to uplift those below us or who are more disadvantaged than us in actually dismantling structures of disadvantage. So intersectionality is not simply limited to those who've worked on it and those who have been at the helm of developing it. It is a transformative theory which has to do with all forms of disadvantage at the same time. Another myth which goes around is that intersectionality is for everyone. So while it is true that intersectionality is for all kinds of disadvantages, it's not a theory which can help understand everyone's life. So the intersection of whiteness and maleness is not something intersectionality has ever considered. It's not been written about, primarily because disadvantage, or as your definition says, it's the structures of oppression and power are specifically to do with those who are dispossessed, not those who are not dispossessed, right? So feminism may be for everyone, intersectionality may be for all dispossessed people, but intersectional discrimination or intersectional feminism doesn't illuminate forms of privilege, for example. It's particularly to be employed as a radical, subversive idea to be thinking about disadvantage. The third myth is that it's simply about identity politics. I think I have mentioned that intersectionality is grounded in identity, but it is to do with improving the life conditions and the structural disadvantage and discrimination people face because of the identities they have, right? So they do want to draw attention to the identities in terms of their lived experience, but intersectionality theory wants to do more than that. It wants to draw attention to change how those identities lead to disadvantage. So it's not simply stopping at identity politics, it's wielding it with a cause. Second, this has become popular in academia, and this has become popular in a lot of spaces where intersectionality has become popular per se. To say that because it's now so popular, it's all a passe. Intersectionality now doesn't need to be thought about because all of us know intersectionality in some form or the other. It's an easy thing for us to know. Unfortunately, intersectionality is not passe because intersectional discrimination exists, and intersectionality theory will continue to be relevant unless we dismantle and transform the patterns of disadvantage it gives rise to. Finally, intersectionality is everything. It's not. If you think that intersectionality is the panacea for thinking about gender or thinking about discrimination, and nothing else is needed to be cracking gender issues, I think that would be wrong. I think intersectionality performs a particular work in terms of thinking about how forms of discrimination combine and create structures of disadvantage. But I think other subversive radical ideas are equally important. And I think we need to treat intersectionality as one tool in our arsenal for fighting for social justice. It shouldn't be seen as having all the answers. It does have some answers, and I think it should be used for giving the most concrete answers to how patterns of discrimination combine. But that's a very specific and precise work that it should be wielded for. That's all for me.
Okay, so I think I'm going to speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, or maybe a little longer, we'll see, about intersectionality and the intersectional challenge that you guys face in terms of thinking about policy and practice. I will say, for those who don't know me, I lived in Scotland for almost 20 years, and I really miss Scotland. That's another story. And I'm going to draw on some of the work that I used to do in Scotland, really to try to better explain to you guys the challenge of intersectionality, particularly in a Scottish context. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that later. So what I'm going to do today is first I'm going to walk you through some definitions. I know this is the fourth in a series, and so you're probably horrified and overwhelmed with definitions of intersectionality. You're like, I get it, just tell me what to do. But we're gonna go over it just because it's important to define our terms. I'm going to spotlight particularly what inequalities of the intersections looks like in Scotland, because, you know, in some ways Scotland is ahead, but in many ways it is very, very, very far behind, and we're gonna talk about it. And then I have some bad news for you folks. We're gonna, my view is this kind of idea of intersectional gender architecture. Unfortunately, my recommendation to you is to rip it up and start again. And just to say, this is how you know I've lived in Scotland for a really long time. I was thinking about, what should I call this? What's a Scottish connection? Oh, I know, orange juice. Am I dating myself? Rip it up and start it. Is that, no, okay, I'll stop. All right, so I know you guys probably already know that intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. But Crenshaw says herself, and everyone says, that intersectionality has an incredibly long history, and it's not something that bubbled to the surface about 30 years ago. In fact, you can trace it back to the earliest slave narratives of enslaved people as part of the transatlantic slave trade. And I think that's really important. And so what I wanted to do is kind of to illustrate the long intellectual Black feminist history of intersectionality. Because I think we say this, but then I think because so many people are not familiar with the intellectual history of Black feminism, that they kind of think that intersectionality is something new, or for our purposes, that somehow intersectionality can be separated from Black feminism, or that you can do intersectionality without taking race seriously. So first thing I want to do is start with this wonderful quote. Start with this wonderful quote from Sojourner Truth. It's very briefly, Sojourner Truth, you know, the great abolitionist, but also suffragist of America, born in 1790, and she comes to fame, the general kind of international acclaim, because she escapes from her own enslavement with her child, and then successfully sues her enslaver to free her son. So she's a really interesting person in kind of Black feminist intellectual history. And she's talking here in 1851 at the Akron, Ohio, kind of women's suffrage movement convention. And she's just been preceded by a speaker who's saying to kind of this audience of women kind of agitating for the vote that you're too delicate, you're beautiful, we want you on a pedestal, kind of the rough and tumble events of politics, of public space is not for you. And kind of Truth stands up and says, this quote, "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages, lifted over ditches, and have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helped me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman?" And so this highlights really clearly the intersectional challenge that when we're talking about this idea of women, more often than not, we're talking about white women. And especially in this case, we're talking about bourgeois or white middle class women. And so part of the challenge and part of kind of Black feminism's raison d'etre is about saying, how can we think about race, class, and gender as intersecting in order to understand how that generates inequalities, but then also importantly, also generates a public politics by which to organize around. So that's an American example. A key example in the British context is Claudia Jones. You guys know Claudia Jones, born, well, hopefully you'll know now after this, born in 1915 in Trinidad, and then comes to Harlem, New York City in 1922 with her parents. She's radicalized by the white supremacist violence of the American South and joins the Communist Party of America. She becomes an editor, one of their best speakers, one of their best organizers. And she's working at this time in the 40s and 50s, at the height of McCarthyism. And she is declared an enemy of the state of America, and then she's deported out of the United States. The British government, because at this time, of course, Trinidad is still a British colony, the British government didn't want her back in Trinidad because she was so good of an organizer. They're like, we don't need her causing trouble in the colonies. And so she's deported to London, right in the middle of the Windrush generation rebuilding of the United Kingdom after the Second World War. And she's a fascinating figure. And her analysis is really one of the roots, part of the legacy of intersectionality. She says this: "The triply oppressed Negro woman is a barometer for the status of all women, and that fight for the economic, political, and social equality of the Negro woman is in the vital self-interest of white workers." So this is something to always bear in mind. When we're talking about intersectionality, class plays an essential role. But what's crucial here is that you cannot separate class from race from gender. All of these kind of social positions are interconnected and interlocking. And so when people say, "Oh, that identity politics," there is no part of this intellectual history that's talking about some airy-fairy stuff. This is about people deeply concerned with the material conditions of their lives. And it's not just people, it's Black women in particular. So 2 more examples so you get a sense of what I mean when I say Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term, but this is a long intellectual history that you have to get a grip of if you're serious about this work. So I want to introduce you to Johnny Tillman, who I think is my general badass, who people probably don't know very well. Johnny Tillman was a trade unionist, but also welfare rights advocate. She was born in 1926 in Arkansas in the United States, and then moves west, moves to California in order to escape white supremacist violence of the Jim Crow South. She organizes, she works in an industrial laundry, she's a shop steward there and organizes the workers. And then she falls ill and she's forced to claim benefits. And her interactions with the American welfare state, I hope will have resonance for you, because the same things that we find in terms of universal credit and sanctioning, all the rest of it, she found, almost 50 years ago in 1970s America. She talks about how the welfare state is cruel, it's misogynistic, using the exact same terms that Phil Alston, who was the UN representative and analyzing the British welfare state in 2019, she finds the same thing 50 years ago with the American welfare state. But here's a great example of what intersectionality looks like. She says this: I'm a woman, I'm a Black woman, I'm a poor woman, I'm a fat woman, I'm a middle-aged woman, and I'm on welfare. In this country, if you're any one of those things, you count less as a human being. If you're all of those things, you don't count at all. And anyone who does any work on anti-poverty knows that this could be said, this could have been, you know, this reflects the work of the Poverty Truth Commission. It reflects the work of anyone doing any kind of meaningful anti-poverty work that works with benefits claimants. Things have not changed, but note how the focus on race, class, gender, age here, and how that is an analysis of social conditions, but also is a way of articulating a kind of politics. And I just want to just emphasize that again. And then finally, because we have actually some of the original founders of this group in the room today, which is super exciting to me. So I'm really happy to be able to pay homage to the Scottish Black Women's Group, because oftentimes I think when we talk about these things, we talk about England, we talk about America, and we think that Scotland doesn't have its own very clear Black feminist intellectual history and tradition that has tried to take seriously issues of intersectionality and desperately trying to get, in particular, white feminists to take seriously the idea of race. And so the Scottish Black Women's Group, who Makame Macrum I see is in the room, Rowena Arshad, my old boss at the University of Edinburgh, Philomena de Lima, all of these people, Anita Shelton, all of these people were part of this group that was seeking to advocate, take seriously issues of race, class, and gender in a Scottish context. And so this is from their kind of statement that was written in 1985. They said, we had to begin to unpack the effects of racism, sexism, and class on ourselves and on the individuals and groups we had to deal with. We had to deal with and live with. We wanted a stake in making the rules of the game of life. And when we did, the doors began to close. Please bear in mind this quote, because I'm going to show you something, a quote that echoes this, that's almost 30 years later. So just remember this quote. So I kind of spent some time talking about kind of a little bit of the intellectual history of intersectionality to emphasize again, this is nothing new. It's nothing new to us, it might be new to you. And it's important to understand that, but also crucially and importantly, if you're serious about intersectionality, you're going to get serious about taking race seriously in any kind of feminist analysis or gender-based analysis of inequality in Scottish society. So that being said, what do we mean when we talk about intersectionality? Very straightforward. This is not rocket science, but it is deceptively difficult. What we mean by intersectionality is this. It's about understanding how race, class, gender, sexuality, and disability interact in particular ways that benefit some groups and disadvantage others. And by the way, the social science is clear. Race is the best predictor of understanding someone's class position. It's the best predictor in understanding someone's access to resources. All you have to do is look at the COVID crisis at the moment. You see who is hit hardest. Guess what? Racialized groups. What a surprise. And then layer on top of that, oh, look, it's those who are in working class households because they're more likely to not be able to shield at home, right? And they're kind of frontline and essential workers. But it's important to kind of race have to be at the center of this. And I think what's also crucial to understand here as well is when we're talking about intersectionality, this is an analytical tool. This is a way of seeing the world. It's a perspective, a way of knowing and understanding and encountering the world. And it's also a politics. And I think that's what's so crucial and important about this. Once you see and understand the world in a particular way, that should motivate you, activate you, and mobilize you to action. That's what's so crucial. And that's the lesson from Sojourner Truth all the way up to the Scottish Black Women's Group. All right. And as I said, and I just kind of have to emphasize this because intersectionality is incredibly fashionable. It's really, really popular. But you can't understand intersectionality without taking seriously Black feminism. And intersectionality was developed by Black feminists, for Black feminists, in order to name and take seriously our experiences. Because the Combie River Collective stated way back 1977, so almost kind of 50 years ago, they say this: we realize that the only people who care enough about us to work consistently for our liberation are us. They were talking about kind of white socialists, they were talking about white feminists, and they were also talking about Black nationalists, right? And so the point always is that existing at the intersections means that you fall between various stools, right? So kind of the socialists only want to talk about class. The kind of the feminists, the white feminists only want to talk about gender, and then the Black nationalists only want to talk about race, but very few people want to talk about those things simultaneously, even though we live those experiences. And that's why, again and again, and you're going to get a hard time from me if you try to do this, you try to separate race from intersectionality. One quick thing, and I know you guys are like, oh, intersectionality, you're killing me with this, but I do think it's important to understand that when we talk about intersectionality, this is not a fancy way, this is not just a dumb academic way of talking about diversity. These are two different things with very different issues, concerns, and outcomes. Diversity, do your thing, it's not my jam, but this is something that's important to some people, which is about trying to seek the inclusion of marginalized groups into institutions. And arguably that's perhaps what the intersectional gender architecture is trying to do, but that's another story. But intersectionality says there is no institution. Institutions are built in ways that are meant to marginalize and to exclude. And the solution is not just to have a couple of tokens inserted into the system and think, wow, great, job done. No, there has to be root and branch change, root and branch reform. Rip it up and start again, so you can decide for yourself whether that's reform or not. But that is the challenge, to say, if you think just getting a couple of Black and brown faces around a table, you think that's, you're done, unfortunately not. And that's where a lot of the conflict comes from, because people think, you're here, you're at the table, what more do you want? And you're like, actually, we want it all, we want everything. All right. So I've talked about intersectionality, but not diversity. I'm gonna skip because I wanna make sure we get to the meat of the matter. Because I want to talk about how inequalities are generated at these intersections, particularly of race, class, and gender. And what's so interesting and important about intersectionality, what it offers you guys in terms of being policymakers or practitioners or activists, it offers a way of understanding and taking seriously ideas of complexity and ideas of difference. So for those who don't know, this is Audre Lorde, the poet, the poet and writer and publisher who's here silently judging you. So, and what's really important about intersectionality and the focus on issues of complexity is this idea that complex inequalities can never be understood, nor can we take effective action if we keep using concepts that reinforce homogeneity or reinforce group sameness. So when we talk about an idea of, say, the National Council, Advisor Group for Women and Girls, which women and girls is always the question I ask, right? Which women and girls? It's a helpful starting point, but unless we get further kind of details on to whom we refer, we default to the dominant group, right? And I think, at least speaking to some people who are part of this circle and other people who are on the advisory committee, that's at least to a limited degree something that's actually happened. So when we talk about issues of the working class, which part of the working class? More often than not, especially in Britain and America, when people talk about the working class, they're talking about the white working class, not understanding that there are other groups who are part of the working class. But you see where I'm going with this. Talking in these broad terms not only flattens out difference, it also makes it incredibly difficult to understand and to take action on the particular inequalities that different groups face. So that's something to bear in mind. And that's a real challenge, because I think we want these tidy terms because we think that actually makes it easier to solve problems. But what it does, and for those on the outside, what it means is that it demonstrates that you're not taking kind of their particular issues and concerns seriously. So I'm going to show you what I mean by that and what this means in terms of Scotland. And so, I was saying at the beginning of the talk that Scotland is a really interesting case, right? Because it's really good on some issues and then really bad on other issues. And in the Scotland case, again and again and again, and there are plenty of people in the room who can attest to this, is that Scotland is fantastic about talking about class and very good about, it's perfectly fine about talking about gender. And then sometimes every now and again, disability and sexuality will come in and out of focus, as it were. And that's to be, as an American who lived in Scotland and now lives in England, I miss these kinds of analyses that kind of take seriously these ideas. But the ongoing issue and problem in Scotland is that race and racism are consistently seen, understood, and defined as something that happens over there. This is a problem for England. This is a problem for America. We in Scotland are egalitarian, we're open, we're welcoming, we're all of these things, right? And that's a huge challenge, and that's a huge problem, because counterintuitively, the egalitarian discourse, the egalitarian, agreement that is, present but always slightly frayed in Scotland means that we can't have honest and open conversations about race and racism. And what that means is that women of color who seek to, try to take seriously ideas of complexity and difference find again and again that they are delegitimized and undermined, because people are more, confident and, but also have I think a very clear political interest in only wanting to talk about class, only wanting to talk about gender, and then race is something that we don't have to worry about because also the numbers are so small. This isn't a problem for us. So remember when I said, remember the quote from the Scottish Black Women's Group from 1985. I wanted to show you the echoes of that, of how very little has changed. So 10 years, so I've been studying austerity in Scotland in one way or another for about 10 years, which is truly one of the most depressing and horrifying things I've done, but that's how it is. And part of what I did was kind of interview women of color activists, anti-austerity activists, to try to understand how they were, organizing against austerity. And so you'll see that these two quotes come from 2012, so 8 years ago. But I'm still in contact with, of course, the people that I speak with. And so I contacted these people again ahead of our meeting today to say, and read them back these quotes and say, has anything changed, or would you like to modify what you said 8 years ago? And they said, not only has nothing changed, but in fact, things have gotten worse. And so I'm laying this at your feet to say that something has gone horribly wrong, and I think it's important to understand that. So this is a Scottish Asian anti-austerity activist that I interviewed in Edinburgh way back in 2012. And this is what she said. If policymakers, that's you guys, but also the council, if policymakers wanted to listen to us, they would come to us when they've written zero of their policy, not when they've written 99% of it. So when it comes to minority women's issues, or minority people's issues more widely, we are the afterthought, always. And I'll just point to you that I think Deborah, when she contacted me to kind of speak to you guys, she said this is kind of the last of the series on whatever. And so kind of it's interesting because it's kind of a backwards way of looking at it. So intersectionality shouldn't come last, it should be first. But this is part of the problem of going, oh, we've kind of missed something out. Let's go speak to you now, right? To kind of make up the numbers. And so this is 2012, we're here in 2020, and we see the same dynamics in place, right? And of course, 1985, the Scottish Black Women's Group said the exact same thing. So here's a West African migrants' rights activist in Glasgow saying something fairly similar. So if you guys who are in the room are not policymakers, you're practitioners, you're on the ground doing things, well, here's what she has to say to you guys. She says, quote, ethnic minority groups are trying to drive in their humble way different causes, but how do you link with the local people, the indigenous people? It's almost impossible. You don't seem to find an avenue to join in when people are doing their thing, so you somehow find yourself on the sidelines all the time. Even if you did your thing, you won't be able to attract them, she's talking about white Scots, to come with you because it's so segregated. And so this is someone who's working on the ground, trying to kind of stop kind of local services from being cut and closed and all the rest of it, and reaching out and could not find those connections. And so the same thing again and again of wanting to kind of work across difference. We see that there's a problem here in Scotland, an ongoing and systemic and problem that well, hopefully we can have a conversation about. Right, so I'm coming to the end. I know you guys would like to thank God for this. But so back to orange juice, rip it up and start again. I know Deborah and the rest of the council don't want to hear this, but I'm telling you anyway, that this idea of intersectional gender architecture does not make any sense. Not only, Helene and I were talking before this session about how not only is this language not great, because even, as a fancy professor, I'm like, okay, well, I don't understand what this means, but also just to take it on its own terms. The idea that anything could be intersectional gender literally does not make sense, because gender, whether you like it or not, and whether you take it seriously or not, gender is always raced and always classed. That the experiences of white middle-class women are different from the experiences of white working class women, are different from the experiences of white disabled women, and are different from the experiences of Black working class women. And so whether you want to believe it or not, that talking about intersectional gender does not make any sense. Either you confront the challenge of understanding how race and class always work on gender, or you're committed to not doing it wrong. I'm just putting it out there. And part of the conclusion to this is to say, if you're going to take this seriously, if you're going to take a feminist analysis seriously, if you're going to take any kind of gender lens to kind of policy making and practice, you're going to have to get to grips with race, racism, and anti-racism. Otherwise, what is the point? And you're wasting everyone's time. There's no way around that. And I think this is really important in the Scottish context, because Philomena de Lima, when I first came to Scotland, she had a report out called Needs Not Numbers, and about kind of the experiences of minority ethnic groups in the Highlands. I've never forgotten reading that report and her saying that, and because I come from the States, right? And so I've never been in mostly or always all white spaces. And so there's assumption somehow that, first of all, that people of color don't exist in Scotland, or they exist in small pockets and places, or that all white spaces somehow are not racialized, that there aren't power dynamics at play in spaces that are all white. That isn't, no one is saying that people are racist, no one is saying that. But what we're saying is the presence of people of color in spaces does not mean that race then becomes important. Race is always important. And if you're serious about kind of taking an intersectional approach, then you will understand that white folks have a race, are racialized, and are racialized in particular ways. And that's part of the challenge that most people don't want to kind of get to grips with. But what I'm hoping that in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, in light of Brexit and Trump, in light of the kind of COVID inequalities, that we will understand and take seriously this idea of race, and we will integrate that in meaningful and serious ways into our feminist analyses or gender-based analyses, whatever you want. And I think this is my last slide. So I'll say this, that again and again, the evidence is this, that you can't reverse engineer, you can't retrofit solidarity or trust. You can't add people at the end and think that they're going to work with you, they're going to trust you, or you're going to get anything done. Sometimes that happens, but more often it doesn't, because you're inviting people into a space that you've created for your own interests, not for shared interests. So if you're serious about the intersectional challenge of the work that you do, then you will build projects and processes with women of color from the ground up. Not inviting people, just like that activist said, when 99% of the policy has been written, you're not going to invite people after the fact and then think they're going to be grateful because you've invited them into a space. People have been saying this literally for 150 years. Hopefully the lesson will be learned now. And linked to that is this idea of, especially for people who do work on gender or think of themselves as feminists, is that there's going to have to be some sort of mourning and giving up of universal terms of women and girls. I know you guys are like, oh no, this is this identity politics, or this kind of, oh, this is awful. And don't worry, we're not going to get into the trans debate here. But what I will say is this, that speaking in these universal terms means what more often than not, people are defaulting to describing and discussing the dominant white experience. Full stop. Because if you haven't built things with other kinds of people, then you are only describing mostly your own experience with the dominant group's experience, just full stop. And so there's going to have to be some sort of opening up to kind of be more particular in the ways in which you're talking about, inviting, and supporting and working with different types of groups. And I guess I will say that whilst it might be helpful for people to kind of really take seriously this idea of maybe letting go of some of these universal terms, this isn't a disaster and you shouldn't be paralyzed into inaction, because what we know again and again and again, that it is possible to build solidarity and to work across difference. The long, long history of anti-racist feminist activism and action in Scotland demonstrates that. The history of the history of the civil rights movement demonstrates that. We're living through the history of Black Lives Matter that literally is about understanding different aspects of the Black experience and saying that whether you're gay, straight, trans, cis, poor, working class, middle class, that all Black lives matter. So if these groups somehow and mysteriously can work across very real differences, then what are we doing here? So I'm going to finish there. Yeah.